Clara Whitmore drove the blade clean through the pig's hindquarter, and the crack of bone against the wooden block rang out across the empty kitchen like a gunshot at midnight. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She had been awake for 22 hours, and she intended to be awake for 22 more, if that was what it took. Outside Montana was cold and indifferent. Inside that kitchen, Clara was building something out of nothing, and she was not going to stop. Before we go any further into this story, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and follow along with me all the way to the very end, because what happens between these two people is not something you want to miss a single moment of. And when you're done watching, leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that kitchen and to the night that changed everything at Blackwood Ranch. The foreman, a leathered, sun-worn man named Holt Greer, had ridden hard to reach the ranch house before dark. He didn't tie his horse properly. He didn't knock. He shoved the front door open and called into the empty hallway with a voice that was trying very hard not to sound like a man delivering a death sentence. "Miss Whitmore, you in here?" Clara came out of this kitchen carrying a cast-iron pot with both hands, the steam rising up around her face and into the low ceiling of the front room. She set it on the side table without ceremony and looked at Holt directly the way she always did. No flinching, no deference, no polite tilting of the head that women in town had learned to perform around men who expected it. "I'm here," she said. Holt pulled his hat from his head. He turned it in his hands twice. That was how Clara knew it was bad. "Got word from Helena this morning," he said. The buyer walked. Clara didn't move. "Walked how?" she asked. "Walked clean." Holt pressed his lips together. "Deal's dead. Contract ain't worth the paper it was wrote on. Mr. Blackwood's riding home with nothing." The kitchen behind her was still making noise, the fire popping the beans, shifting in their pot, the low gurgle of something slow cooking in the dark back corner of the stove. All of that noise continued without interruption, the way the world keeps turning, even when you've just been handed the worst possible news. Clara said, "How far out is he?" "Day and a half, maybe 2. "Is he coming straight home, or is he going to stop in Billings?" Holt blinked. I don't rightly know, ma'am. I suppose he might. He's got friends out. He won't stop." Clara said more to herself than to Holt. A man who's been beaten like that doesn't want friends. He wants to get home and be alone with it. Holt stared at her. He'd been foreman at Blackwood Ranch for 11 years. He'd worked alongside hired hands and servants and traveling workers of every kind, and he had never once heard the kitchen woman speak with that kind of certainty about what Nathaniel Blackwood would or wouldn't do. He didn't know what to say to it, so he said nothing. "Go on and make sure the south pasture gate is latched," Clara told him, picking up the pot again. "And tell the boys not to be out front when Mr. Blackwood rides in. Give him room." Holt put his hat back on his head and walked out. He didn't argue. He told himself later that he didn't know why she was just the cook, but in the moment it had simply not occurred to him to push back. Clara went back into the kitchen and began. She had maybe 36 hours, possibly less. She knew exactly what she was going to do. What most people understood about Clara Whitmore was very little, and what they understood wrong was nearly everything. In the town of Meridian, 12 miles southwest of the ranch, Clara was known primarily as two things: large and quiet. The large part they said out loud. The quiet part they said like it was a polite substitute for slow or simple or not worth the trouble of learning. She had arrived in Meridian 8 months earlier from Cheyenne, where she had spent 4 years working in a boarding house kitchen that fed 30 men 3 times a day. Before that, she had kept accounts for a dry goods store in Laramie for 2 years, until the owner's eldest son took over and decided a woman of her size and her plainness did not represent the kind of establishment he wished to project to customers. She had been 23 years old when she left Laramie. She had been 25 when she left Cheyenne. She was 27 now, and she had learned with the kind of precision that only repeated disappointment can teach you exactly how much room most people were willing to make for someone who looked the way she looked. They made just enough room for her to be useful. Never quite enough for her to matter. Nathaniel Blackwood had hired her because she had shown up at the right moment the morning after his previous housekeeper left without notice, and because she had quoted him a fair wage without flinching and had not performed the kind of nervous, eager-to-please presentation that he found exhausting in applicants. She had simply told him what she could do, asked to see the kitchen and the pantry walk through both without being invited, and come back to say she'd take the job. He had almost smiled at that. Almost. In the months that followed, he spoke to her perhaps 4 times a week, always about practical things. Did they need flour? Was the roof over the south storage room leaking again? Could she do something about the smell coming from the old smokehouse? Because he suspected there was an animal trapped in the walls. He did not ask how she was doing. He did not learn where she was from. He looked at her the way he looked at the furniture, noting whether it was in place and functioning, and looking away when it was. Clara had been looked at that way her whole life. She had stopped being wounded by it somewhere around age 14, when she had realized that being wounded by it was a luxury she could not afford. What she had done instead was watch, and listen, and learn. She had learned Nathaniel Blackwood the way she learned every kitchen she'd ever worked in, methodically, quietly, without advertising that she was doing it. She had learned that he woke before the sun every single day, and drank his coffee black, and stood at the east-facing window for exactly the length of time it took to finish the cup, staring at the land with an expression she recognized because she had seen it before on other men who loved something they were afraid of losing. She had learned that he worked harder than any of his hired hands, but never once mentioned it. She had learned that he ate alone every evening and cleared his own plate to the kitchen door without being asked, and that he always left a portion untouched, not because he didn't want it, but because waste embarrassed him, and leaving a little meant he wasn't taking everything. She had also learned his books. That had not been part of her job. Nathaniel had not asked her to look at anything beyond the kitchen inventory. But 3 weeks after she arrived, she had found a stack of invoices wedged behind the flour barrel, shoved there in apparent frustration. And she had pulled them out and looked at them, and what she saw made her sit down on the kitchen stool and read them twice more to make sure she was seeing correctly. The numbers were wrong. Not in the catastrophic, fraudulent way, but wrong in the quiet, creeping way that eventually became catastrophic. Suppliers charging 8 cents more per bushel than the going rate in Billings. Feed costs logged at prices from 3 years earlier, which meant nobody had renegotiated anything since before the drought. A note about a grazing arrangement on the eastern acreage that appeared to have been allowed to lapse, meaning the ranch was paying for land access they were already legally entitled to. Small things. Small things that stacked up month after month into something that looked from the outside like a ranch that was simply failing. Clara had put the invoices back. Then she'd found more. Then she'd found the ledger sitting on the shelf in the front room, where Nathaniel clearly felt it was sufficiently private that no one would touch it, which meant he'd underestimated the reach of a woman with a good memory and a reason to pay attention. She didn't take the ledger. She didn't need to. She read it standing at the shelf on 3 separate evenings, while Nathaniel was in the barn, and she committed what she needed to commit to memory, and she put it back exactly as she'd found it. What the ledger told her was, this Blackwood Ranch was not a dying operation. It was a mismanaged one. And the gap between those two things was the gap between a problem with no solution and a problem with many solutions. None of them complicated, all of them requiring someone who was paying attention to the details. By the time Nathaniel left for Helena in pursuit of the cattle contract, Clara had been paying attention for 5 months. She had also been doing something about what she found. She had started with the suppliers. She had written letters, plain direct with no preamble, informing 3 separate supply companies in Billings and Great Falls that she was comparing their current prices against the regional market rate and would be grateful for a correction or would be taking her business elsewhere by month's end. 2 of them wrote back within a week with adjusted figures. The third had a man ride out in person to discuss the matter, a young traveling representative who had clearly not expected to be met at the kitchen door by a woman who quoted him invoice numbers from memory and did not apologize once for the inconvenience of accuracy. He left with a new agreement. Clara had written it out herself and had him sign it at the kitchen table over 2 cups of coffee. She had renegotiated the grazing arrangement language with the neighbor to the east, a quiet older man named Aldous Finch, who turned out to be perfectly reasonable once she explained in plain terms what the original document had actually said, versus what everyone had been operating as if it said. He hadn't been cheating anyone. He simply hadn't known. Neither had Nathaniel. And so they had been paying for something they owned month after month, and calling it the cost of doing business. She had reorganized the smokehouse and identified which stores would last the winter and which needed to be used before the cold deepened. She had tracked what was being wasted in the kitchen and adjusted the ordering accordingly. She had found 2 barrels of salt pork behind the woodpile that someone had apparently forgotten existed, and she had used them to reduce the meat order by nearly 2 weeks' worth. She had done all of this quietly without telling anyone because nobody had asked her opinion, and she had learned long ago that a woman who offered her opinion without being invited was treated very differently than a woman who simply solved the problem and let the solution speak. But when Holt walked in that evening and told her the Helena deal was dead, Clara understood that the time for quiet solving was over. Nathaniel would return in 2 days. He would ride in believing that the ranch was finished, not just the cattle deal, but the whole thing. The land, the future. The years of work his father had started and he had tried to continue. He would ride in having spent 2 days alone with that belief, letting it settle into his bones, the way cold settles in when you've been wet too long, until it stops feeling like a temporary condition and starts feeling like the truth. Clara knew what that did to a man. She had watched it happen before to men who had lost things they hadn't known how to lose. It didn't kill them outright. It just made them stop trying. And once a man stopped trying, no ledger correction or renegotiated supply contract in the world was enough to save what he'd abandoned. She couldn't let Nathaniel Blackwood stop trying. Not because she needed this job, although she did. Not because she had nowhere else to go, although that was also true. But because she had spent 5 months watching a man work himself to the bone for something he genuinely loved, and she had also spent 5 months quietly learning that the thing he was afraid of losing was not actually as close to lost as everyone believed, including him. She needed him to still be fighting when she told him that. And a man who had just ridden 2 days through defeat needed something more than words to keep him fighting. He needed proof that someone else still believed in the ranch. He needed to open that door and see that belief made physical, made real, made warm, made into something he could smell from the front porch before he even got his boots off. So Clara Whitmore drove the blade through the pig's hindquarter at midnight on a Thursday, and she got to work. She had the pig on the spit before 2 in the morning. She had the bread dough rising by 3. She had the beans on the fire by 4, slow and steady, with the right amount of salt, and the piece of cured pork she'd been saving since October, because she'd had a feeling there would come a moment that needed it. Holt found her still working when he came in at 6 to start his day. He stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at her for a moment. "You been here all night," he said. "Go get your coffee," Clara told him. "And don't come back in this kitchen till I call you." He went and got his coffee. He didn't come back. The ranch hands moved through the morning at a distance, the smell reaching them across the yard and making them stop whatever they were doing and look toward the house. 2 of them came to the kitchen window at different points in the morning and looked in without knocking, and Clara looked back at them without pausing what she was doing, and both of them walked away. By midday, the bread was done. By early afternoon, the potatoes were roasting in the dripping fat beneath the pig, catching everything that fell and giving it back as something better. By late afternoon, Clara had washed up, changed her apron, and begun setting the table. Not her table. Nathaniel's table. The long wooden one in the main room where he ate alone every night, where she had placed his plate and removed it every evening for 5 months without sitting down herself, without being asked to stay, without being offered even a passing acknowledgement beyond a nod that said the food was acceptable. She set that table tonight as if it were something that mattered, because it was. She placed the bread in the center, first, still warm. She arranged the potatoes around the edges of the platter. She moved the pig from the spit to the table herself, refusing Holt's offer to help because this was her work and she intended to carry it herself. She set 2 plates, not 1. Holt noticed. He didn't comment. Outside, the sun was beginning to pull toward the horizon when Clara heard the horse, She heard it before anyone else did not, because her hearing was sharper, but because she had been listening for it for 6 hours. The particular sound of a tired horse moving at the pace of a rider who isn't in a hurry because hurrying no longer matters. She dried her hands on her apron. She stood beside the table, and she waited. The front door opened slowly, the way doors open when the person pushing them has no expectation of welcome. Nathaniel Blackwood came through it still wearing his trail coat, his hat tipped low, the particular slump in his shoulders of a man who has carried something heavy for too long. He stopped. The smell hit him before the sight did. Clara watched his head come up a fraction, then more, the way an animal lifts its head when it detects something it wasn't prepared for. His eyes found the table. He stood there for a long moment, and Clara watched him take in the whole of it. The pig, the bread, the candlelight she had lit 20 minutes ago because she'd wanted him to walk into something warm. Then his eyes found her. She held his gaze and did not look away. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked back at the table. When he looked at her again, there was something in his expression she hadn't seen in 5 months. Something raw and confused, and not quite anger, because anger would have been easier. "Why?" he said. Just that one word, low and rough and tired. "Because you need to eat," Clara said. "The deal fell through," he said like she might not know, like the words themselves were something he had to say out loud before he could make himself believe them. "The contract is gone. The money I was counting on, all of it. We could lose this place." "I know," Clara said. He stared at her. "You know. Holt told me 2 days ago. Now sit down, Mr. Blackwood." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been the beginning of protest. Then it passed. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table the way a man sits down when he has run completely out of argument, and he sat. Clara served him without ceremony. She cut the pork herself and placed it on his plate, and she poured the coffee, and she sat down in the chair at the corner of the table, not at the far end, not at a respectful distance, but at the corner close enough to speak without raising her voice. He looked at the second plate. He looked at her. She looked back without apology. He picked up his fork. For a while they ate in silence, which was its own kind of communication. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in that particular low October way, just enough to let you know it was there. Nathaniel ate steadily, which Clara took as a good sign. A man who had truly given up doesn't eat with that kind of focus, that quiet attention to the plate in front of him. He was still in there. The defeat hadn't finished him. Not yet. When he had eaten most of what she'd given him, he set down his fork and looked at her across the corner of the table. "This cost money we don't have," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, and there was something almost helpless in it. "It cost less than you think," Clara said. "I've been careful." "How careful?" She reached into her apron pocket and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table between them. "Careful enough that I need you to look at some numbers with me." Nathaniel looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she said. "Because tomorrow you're going to wake up believing this place is finished, and I need you to see something before that happens." He was quiet for a long moment. The candle between them moved in some invisible current of air. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, and his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I appreciate what you've done here. I do. But I've been dealing with this ranch's books for 15 years. I think I know." "You know what you've been told?" Clara said. "And you know what you've been looking at. I'm not sure those are the same thing." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Nathaniel reached across the table and picked up the folded paper. He unfolded it slowly. He read it once. Then he read it again. And this time Clara watched his eyes move more carefully across the numbers, the way eyes move when they are no longer reading, but actually seeing. He looked up at her. "These supplier figures," he said. "Where did you—" "I wrote to them," Clara said. 3 companies. 2 adjusted immediately. The 3rd sent a man out. I met with him here. You—" Nathaniel stopped. He looked back at the paper. "This grazing arrangement notation. This is the Finch property line." "Yes. We've been paying for access to the eastern—" You've been entitled to it under the original deed language since 1879, Clara said. Mr. Finch didn't know either. We've corrected it. He was perfectly agreeable. Nathaniel set the paper down. He put both hands flat on the table and stared at them for a moment, and Clara waited. How long have you known about this? He asked. Most of it 3 months, she said. Some of it longer. 3 months, he repeated. I found the invoices behind the flour barrel, she said. I wasn't looking for them, but once I'd seen them, I couldn't pretend I hadn't. Nathaniel lifted his eyes to her face, and Clara saw something change in them slowly, like ice at the very beginning of the thaw, when you can't quite be certain you're seeing movement, but something is different from a moment ago. You fixed all of this, he said. I started fixing it, she said. There's more to be done. The eastern pasture has capacity you haven't used, and there are buyers in Billings I have reason to believe would be worth approaching different buyers, smaller contracts, but more reliable ones. That's not what the Helena deal would have given you, but it's real, and it's available. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time, long enough that another woman might have shifted or looked away. Clara did neither. Why? He said. Why do all of this without telling me? Clara folded her hands in her lap. Because if I had told you 3 months ago that I'd been reading your ledger and writing letters to your suppliers, you would have told me to go back to the kitchen and mind my business. He opened his mouth. He closed it. She gave him a moment with that. Would I have been wrong? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. And the fact that he didn't answer immediately told Clara more than any answer would have. Outside, the wind shifted. The fire dropped lower. Somewhere past the east window, one of the horses moved in the stable, a low sound that settled into the silence and was absorbed by it. No. Nathaniel Blackwood said at last, his voice even and quiet and carrying the full weight of a man who is honest enough to be honest even when it costs him. You wouldn't have been wrong. Clara nodded once. Then you understand why I waited until now. He looked at the paper again. He looked at the table, the food, the careful arrangement, the second plate. He looked at the candle. You stayed up all night for this, he said. I stayed up all night for the ranch, Clara said. The food was part of the argument. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the memory of what a smile felt like. It was the first time in 5 months Clara had seen anything like it, and it lasted only a moment, but she noted it the way she noted everything. You said there's more to be done, he said. A great deal more, she said. And you'd be willing... He stopped, started again. You're not leaving. It wasn't quite a question. I wasn't planning to, Clara said. Not unless you ask me to. Nathaniel looked at her across the corner of that table in the candlelight, with the smell of roasted pork still warm in the air between them, and he did not ask her to leave. Tell me about the eastern pasture, he said, and Clara reached into her other apron pocket and pulled out the second sheet of paper, the one she had been carrying for 6 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and she unfolded it and laid it on the table beside his plate, and she began to talk. She talked for a long time, and Nathaniel Blackwood, for the first time in 5 months, listened. Not the way he listened when she told him the pantry needed restocking. Not the way a man listens to someone he has decided in advance has nothing of importance to say. He listened the way a man listens when he has just discovered in the middle of the worst night of his recent memory that the person sitting 3 feet away from him has been quietly, methodically, and without any demand for recognition, fighting for the same thing he had nearly given up on. He listened, like it mattered, because it did. They talked until the candle burned down to nothing. Clara didn't notice the moment it happened. 1 second there was light from the wick, and the next there was only the glow from the fireplace. And Nathaniel had leaned forward slightly in his chair, the way people do when they are trying to see something more clearly, and the light is failing them. He didn't get up to find another candle. Neither did she. The fire was enough, and neither of them wanted to break what was happening at that table by doing something as ordinary as lighting a candle. By the time Clara gathered her papers and stood up, the clock above the fireplace read 20 minutes past 11. She had been awake for over 40 hours. Her feet ached in the particular deep way that goes past soreness into something structural, something that lives in the bones rather than the muscle, and her lower back had been protesting quietly for the last 2 hours. She had ignored all of it with the same focused discipline she applied to everything else. Nathaniel stood when she stood. It was an automatic gesture, old-fashioned and instinctive, and Clara suspected he wasn't fully aware he'd done it. She noted it anyway. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked at him. "I'll want to sit down with all of this again in the morning," he said, "when I've had some sleep and can think straight." "I'll have the full ledger comparison ready by 7, she said. "And the notes on the eastern pasture boundary." He nodded slowly. He was still holding the second sheet of paper, the one with the pasture figures, and he looked at it once more before folding it carefully along the original creases and setting it beside his plate. "You should sleep," he said. It came out gruff, not unkind. "I intend to," Clara said. She carried the dishes to the kitchen, washed the plates herself, rather than leave them for morning, banked the fire on the stove, checked the latch on the back door, and went to her room. She was asleep inside of 4 minutes. What she did not know, what she would not know for some time, was that Nathaniel Blackwood did not go to sleep. He sat back down at the table after she left in the dark and the firelight, with the folded paper in front of him and the smell of the food still in the air, and he sat there for a very long time, thinking about a woman he had barely looked at for 5 months. The next morning came fast and cold. Clara was up before 5, which was the same time she was always up because the body stops asking permission after enough years of early rising and simply begins doing it on its own. She had the coffee on and the figures laid out on the kitchen table before Nathaniel came through the door at 6:30, his hair combed and his jaw shaved, which told her he had slept at least a few hours and wanted to approach the morning with some semblance of command. She poured his coffee without being asked. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, not the main room table, not the formal space of the night before, but the small working table in the kitchen, where Clara had done most of her real thinking over the past months. And he looked at the papers she'd laid out, and he said without preamble, "Show me where to start." She started with the suppliers because it was concrete and the numbers were already corrected, and it was the kind of thing a man could hold on to when he was still finding his footing. She walked him through the 3 letters she had written and the responses she'd received, and she showed him the difference in monthly cost before and after. And she watched his face move through a sequence of emotions he was clearly trying to manage. Surprise, then a brief flash of something that was almost embarrassment. Then the controlled, deliberate return to focus. That was apparently how Nathaniel Blackwood handled things that knocked him sideways. "You wrote to Calloway and Sons in Great Falls," he said, pointing to the 3rd letter. "I did." "Calloway's been supplying this ranch since before my father died," he said. "He's not going to take kindly to—" "He already did," Clara said. His son wrote back, "The adjusted price is in the 2nd column." Nathaniel looked at the 2nd column. He looked at the original price. He set down his coffee. "That's 32 cents on the bushel," he said. "Over 12 months on our current order volume, it's significant." He said it flatly, not angry, just absorbing. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you know what the market rate was?" "I wrote to a merchant in Billings I found in your correspondence file," Clara said. "A man named Gerald Purdy. He'd written to you about a possible feed arrangement 2 years ago. You hadn't responded." Nathaniel frowned. "I don't remember." "You had a difficult winter that year," Clara said simply, and did not elaborate because she didn't need to and he didn't need her to. He looked at her. "You went through my correspondence file." "I did," she said, without apology, without explanation beyond the facts. "I found it in the front room. I wasn't looking for it. But once I found it, I read it because it seemed relevant." There was a long pause. Clara held it. She had learned that holding silence was its own kind of argument, that filling it too quickly was a form of apology she wasn't willing to offer for something she wasn't sorry for. "All right," Nathaniel said. "Just that. All right." He picked up his coffee again and turned to the next page of figures, and Clara felt something ease in her chest by a fraction of a degree. They worked for 2 hours at that kitchen table. Clara had expected him to take the papers and retreat to the front room to need the private space of his own thinking to process what she was showing him. But he stayed in the kitchen, and he asked questions, and the questions were sharp, not hostile, but genuinely sharp. The questions of a man who understood his land and his business, and was now recalibrating everything he thought he knew about how both had been running. At one point, he asked her to explain the Finch boundary situation again from the beginning, and she did. And this time, he interrupted twice to ask about specific deed language, and both times, she answered correctly, and both times, she watched him absorb that fact. The fact that she knew it had gone to the trouble of knowing it with a quiet that told her he was revising something he hadn't quite articulated yet. Just before 8 o'clock, Holt knocked on the kitchen doorframe and stopped when he saw both of them at the table surrounded by papers. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Clara. He looked at the papers. "Morning," he said with the careful neutrality of a man who has just walked into something he doesn't fully understand and is making rapid calculations about how to proceed. "Holt," Nathaniel said. "The boy's ready. Ready and waiting. Tell them we're pushing the West Pasture inspection to this afternoon. I need the morning." Holt looked again at the papers. He looked at Clara. She did not look back at him because she was writing a correction in the margin of the supply ledger, and the correction required attention. "Yes, sir," Holt said and withdrew. Clara heard him cross the yard toward the stable. She heard faintly the sound of him saying something to one of the hands too low for her to catch the words. She kept writing. "He'll talk," Nathaniel said, not looking up from the page he was reading. "People always do," Clara said. "It won't be—" He stopped. Started again. "What I mean is it won't reflect well on you. A woman in the kitchen at the owner's table before 8 in the morning. People around here will make assumptions." Clara set down her pencil and looked at him directly. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "people have been making assumptions about me my entire life. I stopped trying to prevent assumptions a long time ago. I focus on the facts." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment that went on just slightly longer than the statement required. Then he nodded once and looked back at the ledger. "The Eastern Pasture," he said. "You mentioned buyers in Billings. Tell me more about that." And they kept going. What Clara had not told Nathaniel yet, what she was not ready to tell him, because she needed him steady and focused and not derailed by something he couldn't verify in a morning, was what she had overheard 6 weeks ago. The conversation that had changed everything she was doing from background work into something urgent. She had been in the supply room off the main corridor, taking inventory of the winter stores, when she heard voices in the front room. Nathaniel was out on the range. The voices belonged to 2 men she didn't recognize, or rather she recognized one of them because she had seen him twice in town and knew him by name. Franklin Stead. He was a land broker from Helena, known throughout the county for acquiring properties from owners in financial difficulty, restructuring them and selling them at a considerable profit to interests that were generally not local, and generally not interested in working land the way the families who had built it had worked it. The second man she didn't know. He had a soft voice and a deliberate way of speaking that sounded like someone who had practiced sounding reasonable. They had apparently gotten in through the front door, which Holt had left unlocked that morning, and they were standing in the front room having a conversation they clearly believed was private. Clara had not moved. She had stood very still in the supply room with her clipboard in her hands, and she had listened. What she heard was this: Franklin Stead believed that Blackwood Ranch would be in a position to sell within 90 days. He was discussing a purchase price, a figure that was by Clara's estimate based on what she knew of comparable land values, roughly 40% below what the property was worth. His companion, the soft-voiced man, was apparently a representative of a consortium from the East. She gathered from context that it was a group of investors who were accumulating Western land holdings and needed the acreage as part of a larger assembly. "The Helena deal will fall through," Stead said. "I have it on good authority. Once it does, Blackwood won't have the capital to cover the winter operating costs. He'll need to move fast." "And he'll accept our terms," the soft-voiced man said. "He won't have a choice," Stead said. "He's a proud man. Proud men make bad decisions when they're desperate. He'll take what we offer because it'll feel better than waiting and getting less." There had been more after that: practical details, a proposed timeline, something about a third party in Billings who would be handling the paperwork. But Clara had stopped really hearing the details because her mind had moved past them into the place where it went when it was deciding things. This was not a matter of mismanaged accounts anymore. This was not a matter of overcharged suppliers and an unused grazing provision. This was something deliberate. Someone had been watching Blackwood Ranch bleed slowly, and they had been counting on the bleeding to continue until the ranch went under, and then they intended to walk in and buy the land for a fraction of its value from a man too defeated to fight for it. And they had timed it around the Helena cattle deal, which meant they had information about the deal, which meant someone had been feeding them that information. Clara had stood in that supply room for 6 full minutes after the men left, not moving, running through what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out, and then she had gone back to work. She had not panicked. She had never been a woman who panicked. But she had understood in those 6 minutes that what she did over the next several weeks would determine whether Blackwood Ranch survived. She hadn't told anyone. Not Holt, because she wasn't certain Holt wasn't the source of the information Stead seemed to have. Not Nathaniel, because Nathaniel was already locked into the Helena deal, and introducing this complication would either distract him from closing it, or if the deal fell through anyway, would land on top of the failure like an additional weight at the moment. He could least bear it. She had simply moved faster. She had accelerated everything she was already doing. She had been more aggressive with the supplier corrections. She had written to Gerald Purdy in Billings not just for price comparison, but to open a conversation about alternative buyers, quiet without committing to anything, just establishing contact and possibility. She had worked through 2 consecutive weekends without taking her usual Sunday afternoon rest, mapping out the eastern pasture expansion in detail on a sheet of paper she kept in her apron pocket. She had built a case, a real one, a documented, numbered, verifiable case for why Blackwood Ranch was not a failing operation, but a recoverable one, and she had been building it specifically so that when Nathaniel came home from Helena, whether he came home with the deal or without it, she would have something to put in front of him that was stronger than his own despair. She had not known the deal would fall through, but she had prepared for it. Because that was how Clara operated. She planned for the worst and worked toward the best, and she didn't waste energy on the distance between the two. Now, sitting in the kitchen with Nathaniel Blackwood on the morning after the worst night he'd had in years, she was weighing when to tell him about Franklin Stead. The timing mattered. Too soon, and he would be overwhelmed. Defeat and threat arriving together was too much for any man's footing. Too late, and she risked Stead making a move before Nathaniel knew to watch for it. She needed 1 more day, maybe 2. She needed Nathaniel to see the recovery before he saw the threat. She needed him to understand that the ranch was salvageable before she told him someone was trying to ensure he never discovered that. So she held it. She kept working. She showed him the pasture figures and the Billings contacts and the winter store projections, and she watched him absorb all of it with the focused, careful attention of a man who had been handed something he hadn't expected and was beginning to understand its value. By noon, something had changed in the kitchen. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment she could have pointed to. But somewhere in the middle of the morning, Nathaniel had stopped holding the papers the way a man holds a document he is evaluating, and started holding them the way a man holds a map he intends to follow. At 12:30, Holt came back to report on the West Pasture inspection. He stood in the kitchen doorway again and reported to Nathaniel, and this time his eyes moved to Clara with a different quality than they'd had in the morning. Not wary exactly, but recalibrated, as if he was considering the possibility that the landscape of the ranch had shifted in ways he hadn't fully registered yet. The south fence line took some damage from the October freeze, Holt said, about 40 yards near the creek crossing. How bad? Nathaniel asked. Needs replacing, not just patching, Holt said. 3-4 days of work. Maybe a week if we get another freeze before we finish. Nathaniel nodded. He looked at Clara without quite meaning to. It was a reflex, the kind that develops without you realizing it, the impulse to check a reaction before forming your own. Clara had seen it happen before with other men when they were beginning to trust someone's judgment. "What's the lumber situation?" he asked her. Holt's eyebrows moved upward about 1/4 of an inch. Clara didn't smile. "We have enough for about 60 yards of replacement fencing in the north storage," she said. "I inventoried it in September. If the damage is 40 yards, we're covered. If it spreads into the creek crossing posts, we'll need to order an additional supply, but I've already got a fair price from the mill in Billings on record." Nathaniel nodded again. He looked back at Holt. "Start on the fence tomorrow. We'll order more if we need it." Holt said, "Yes, sir." He looked at Clara one more time. Then he left. The afternoon brought a visitor Clara had not anticipated. She heard the wagon before she could see who was driving it. A light rig, moving at the quick pace of someone with a specific destination, rather than a traveler passing through. She was at the back of the kitchen when it arrived, and it was Nathaniel who answered the front door, so she did not see the initial exchange. But she heard the voice. Franklin Stead had a particular way of speaking smooth, in a way that required effort, like a man who had taught himself to sound at ease because he understood the commercial value of seeming unthreatening. Clara had heard that voice once from a supply room 6 weeks ago. She heard it now through the kitchen wall, and her hands went very still on the work surface. She could not hear the full conversation. She heard Nathaniel's voice lower and more contained than Stead's asking something she couldn't quite make out. She heard Stead respond with something about the community, about concerns about. She caught the phrase, hard times, and neighbors looking out for neighbors, and she understood immediately what he was doing. He was presenting himself as a well-wisher. He was softening Nathaniel up. She took off her apron. She walked through the kitchen, through the connecting corridor, and into the front room. Both men looked at her when she came in. Stead was perhaps 50 heavyset in the way of a man who had once been physically strong and had let it convert to something softer over the years. He had a broad, practiced smile, and the kind of eyes that stayed calculating even when the rest of his face was performing warmth. He looked at Clara the way men like him always looked at women like her, a single dismissive sweep, then the return to the person who mattered. He had already looked away from her before she'd fully crossed the room. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said, and there was a questioning quality to it, not annoyed, but genuine, as if he was asking with his eyes what she was doing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I believe dinner needs your attention in about 20 minutes. She looked at Stead with the same direct, unapologetic gaze she used for everyone. "I'm sorry to interrupt." Stead smiled at her. It was a smile that said she was invisible, and he was being generous by acknowledging she had spoken. "Not at all, dear," he said, and turned back to Nathaniel. Clara positioned herself to the left of the fireplace in the corner, where a person could stand and not be particularly noticed, and she listened. Stead was good. She had to grant him that. He expressed sympathy about the cattle deal with exactly the right amount of restraint, not dwelling on it, not twisting the knife, just acknowledging it as an unfortunate situation. He praised Nathaniel's father. He mentioned several other ranching families in the county who he noted had recently made the difficult but ultimately wise decision to explore other options for their land. He used the phrase long-term security twice, and best interest of your family once, and at no point did he say anything as direct as "I want to buy your ranch." But that was exactly what he was saying. Nathaniel's expression had gone very level. Clara had learned to read that levelness. It was not the levelness of a man who was calm, but the levelness of a man who was containing something and had not yet decided what to do with it. "I appreciate you coming by Mr. Stead," Nathaniel said when Stead paused. "And I hear what you're saying. But I think there may be some misunderstanding about the state of things here." Stead smiled again. "Of course, I wouldn't presume to—" "The ranch is not in the position you seem to believe it is," Nathaniel said. His voice was steady and quiet, and carried the particular weight of a man who has decided to say a thing out loud, partly to hear how it sounds, and partly to make it more real. We had a setback with the Helena contract. That's true. But a setback isn't a collapse, and I'm not entertaining offers at this time. There was a pause. Stead's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. Naturally, he said, I had no intention of... I know what your intention was, Nathaniel said, still quiet, still level. I appreciate the visit. It was a dismissal so polite, it left no room for argument. Stead adjusted his coat and turned toward the door. He passed Clara in the corner without acknowledging her. He had almost reached the door when she spoke. Mr. Stead, she said. He stopped. He turned. He looked at her with the same dismissive sweep as before, but this time there was something slightly more alert behind it, something recalculating. I didn't catch your name, she said, though she knew it perfectly well. Franklin Stead, he said. And you are? Clara Whitmore, she said. I manage the ranch operations. A pause. Not long, but long enough. I thought you were the cook, she said pleasantly. I do that too. Stead looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded with the controlled pleasantness of a man who has been caught slightly off balance and intends to recover the ground at a later time. Miss Whitmore, he said, and left. The door closed. Nathaniel stood in the middle of the room looking at it. Then he turned to Clara. How much did you hear? He asked. Enough, she said. You know who he is. It was not quite a question, but it required an answer. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said. And I need to tell you something about him. Not right now after dinner when Holt is out of the house. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. Why when Holt is out? Clara held his gaze for a moment. Because I'm not certain yet, she said carefully, who Stead has been talking to. The silence that followed that statement was the longest one they'd shared so far. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked at the door again, the closed door, the space where Stead had been. Then he looked back at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the confusion of the night before, not the absorbing focus of the morning, but something harder and more specific. He was beginning to understand that this was not just a financial problem, that the slow bleeding of Blackwood Ranch had not been entirely accidental, and that the woman standing in the corner of his front room, the woman he had barely spoken to for 5 months, the woman he had thought about as he sat alone in the dark last night, she had known it before he did. He had a lot of questions. Clara could see them gathering in his face like weather. After dinner, she said again calmly. He nodded once. He went to get his coat. He was going out to find Holt, she knew, going to walk the work of the day and think while he walked, because that was how he processed things. She had learned that about him in the first week. She went back to the kitchen and she started dinner. She moved through the work steadily the way she always did, but her mind was running the second track. It always ran when she was cooking, reviewing what she knew, ordering the sequence in which she would tell him tonight, anticipating the questions he would ask, and the order he would ask them. He was going to want to know how long she'd known about Stead. He was going to want to know exactly what she'd heard word by word. He was going to ask about Holt not directly at first, but eventually, and that conversation was going to be harder than the one about the suppliers and the pasture figures, because it touched something different, not money. Trust. She was ready for it. She had been ready for most of it for 6 weeks. What she hadn't been entirely ready for, if she was being honest with herself in the way she tried always to be honest, was the look on Nathaniel Blackwood's face when he had turned from the door. She had been looking for something specific when she decided to identify herself to Stead. She had wanted to see Stead's reaction when he realized she was more than the cook. She had gotten that, but she had also caught in her peripheral vision the expression on Nathaniel's face in the moment she'd said, "I manage the ranch operations." And she wasn't entirely sure what to do with what she'd seen there. It hadn't been surprise. Well, it had been slightly. But underneath the surprise was something else. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, which she might not be, which she was trying hard not to assume, something that looked like pride. Not the kind of pride that belongs to the person being looked at. The other kind. She turned back to the stove. She focused on the food. She was a practical woman, and she dealt in practical things, and that expression on his face was not a thing she could plan for or prepare documentation about, and so she set it aside in the place where she set things that needed more information before she could do anything useful with them. Dinner could wait. The conversation tonight could not. She had held the truth about Franklin Stead for 6 weeks, and she had held it for good reasons, and those reasons were still good. But Nathaniel was steadier now than he'd been 24 hours ago. He had seen the numbers. He had heard Clara's assessment of what was possible. He had looked at Stead and sent him away without hesitation. He was ready. And when Clara Whitmore decided someone was ready, she did not waste time. Tonight, she was going to tell him everything. Holt was gone by 7. Nathaniel had sent him to the south pasture with 2 of the younger hands to begin marking the fence line damage before the light failed completely, a task that would keep them occupied well past dark and require the bunkhouse rather than a return to the main house. Clara had watched Nathaniel give that instruction at the end of the afternoon and understood that he had thought it through, that he had wanted Holt occupied and away without making the absence obvious. He was careful. She had known that about him, but it confirmed something. She had the table cleared and the kitchen quiet by the time he came back inside. He hung his coat on the hook by the door, washed his hands at the basin, and came to the kitchen with the focused, contained energy of a man who has been thinking all afternoon and is ready to stop thinking and start talking. He sat down across from her. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She started from the beginning, the supply room, the afternoon 6 weeks ago, the sound of voices she hadn't expected to hear. She told him what she had heard word for word, as close as memory allowed, and she watched his face move through the telling with the controlled steadiness he applied to difficult information. She told him about Stead's timeline, about the consortium from the east, about the phrase "I have it on good authority," and what it implied about an information source inside the ranch's operations. When she got to that part, Nathaniel went very still. "Say that again," he said. "He said he had it on good authority that the Helena deal would fall through," Clara said. "Before it did, before you came home, before Holt had ridden out to tell me." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched. "Holt knew about the Helena deal for weeks," he said. "Yes," Clara said. And Stead said, he said it with the certainty of someone who'd been told directly, not rumor, not speculation. She paused. "I could be wrong, Mr. Blackwood. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you what I heard and what I concluded from it. You know Holt better than I do." Nathaniel stood up from the table. He didn't pace, he wasn't a pacer, but he moved to the far side of the kitchen and stood with his back to her for a moment, and Clara let him have that moment without filling it. When he turned around, his expression had settled into something very quiet and very hard. "How long have you been carrying this?" he asked. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. He said it the way you say something when you're testing how it sounds out loud. "You've been running this kitchen and renegotiating my supply contracts and mapping out my eastern pasture and holding on to this for 6 weeks. I needed you to see the recovery before you saw the threat," Clara said. "If I had told you about Stead the night you came home alongside the news that the deal had fallen through, it would have been too much at once. You would have had no footing. I needed to give you footing first." He looked at her for a long time. "That was a significant decision to make on my behalf," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was, and I made it and I'd make it again, and if you want to be angry about it, I understand. But I needed it to work, more than I needed you to be comfortable with how I did it." Another long silence. Outside, the wind moved against the side of the house. The fire in the kitchen stove ticked and settled. "I'm not angry," Nathaniel said. He said it like he'd checked and was reporting the result honestly. I'm trying to understand the shape of this." "The shape of it," Clara said carefully, "is that someone has been watching your ranch struggle and helping it along. And now that the Helena deal is gone, they'll be moving quickly. Stead doesn't wait. That's not how men like him operate." Nathaniel came back to the table. He sat down, and this time he leaned forward with his forearms on the edge, which was the posture Clara had come to associate with him, engaging fully rather than managing from a distance. "You said the eastern pasture could be used as leverage," he said. "In terms of the alternative buyers in Billings, how fast could that conversation move if we pushed it?" "I've already opened it," Clara said. Nathaniel stopped. "Gerald Purdy," she said. "I wrote to him again last week, not committing to anything, just letting him know a conversation might be possible soon. He wrote back within 4 days. He's interested." Nathaniel looked at her. "You wrote to a potential cattle buyer on behalf of my ranch without telling me." "I wrote to open a door," Clara said. "The same door. Pulling it shut is simple. But if we wait until Stead makes his next move to start that conversation, we lose at least 2 weeks. And 2 weeks is enough time for a man like Stead to create conditions that make the conversation much harder." Nathaniel pressed his lips together. Not in anger, in the particular way of a man recalibrating in real time, adjusting to the fact that the situation he thought he was in is several steps ahead of where he believed it was. "What else have you already done," he said, "that I don't know about yet?" It was not quite an accusation. It was close. Clara reached into her apron pocket and placed a third sheet of paper on the table, then a fourth. Nathaniel looked at them. Then he looked at her. "The third sheet," she said, "is the contact information for a land attorney in Billings named Harrison Cole. He's handled 2 cases involving attempted predatory acquisition of ranching properties in the past 3 years. He won both of them." She tapped the 4th sheet. "That's a summary I wrote of what I heard in the supply room, dated with as close to verbatim transcription as I could produce. It's the kind of document an attorney would need to establish that the acquisition attempt was not legitimate." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel picked up the 4th sheet. He read it slowly all the way through, and Clara watched his expression change as he read, not dramatically, but in the specific way of a man who is understanding for the first time the full size of what he has been walking through without knowing it. The deliberateness of it. The planning. The long, patient calculation of someone who had looked at Blackwood Ranch and seen not a failing operation, but a target. He set the paper down. He didn't speak immediately. "How long has this been going on?" he said finally. "Not the 6 weeks you heard them. How long do you think they've been watching?" "At least a year," Clara said. "Maybe longer." "The timing of certain supply price increases aligns with what I'd expect if someone was feeding information to the vendors, small adjustments, the kind that wouldn't raise alarm individually but compound over time. And the Helena buyer." She paused. "I've been thinking about the Helena buyer." Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. "What about him?" "How did you come to find him?" Clara asked. "Who made the introduction?" The silence that followed was a different quality from all the silences before it. Nathaniel's face changed. Clara watched it happen, watched the specific awful process of a man putting 2 things together that he had never placed next to each other, before seeing the connection and understanding what it meant. It crossed his face like a shadow crossing ground. Fast and then gone, replaced by something very controlled and very cold. "The introduction came through a business associate in Helena," he said slowly. "A man I've known for years. He's known Stead since—" He stopped. He stopped completely. Clara did not say anything. "He introduced me to the buyer," Nathaniel said, each word precise and separate. "And he introduced me to Stead 3 years ago at a stockman's meeting. He's been the connection in Helena every time I've done business there for the past—" He pushed back from the table. "My God." "I don't know that for certain," Clara said quickly. "I'm pointing out the shape. You need to verify it before you act on it. But if I'm right about the shape, then the Helena deal wasn't just a deal that fell through. It was designed to fall through, at the right moment, leaving you in the right condition for Stead to arrive." Nathaniel had both hands flat on the table now, and he was looking at them the way he'd looked at them the night before, the posture of a man containing something large and needing a surface to press against. "His name is Douglas Farrow," he said quietly. Clara wrote it down on the corner of the 4th sheet. "He's been my friend for 14 years, Nathaniel said. "I know," Clara said. "That's why they used him." The kitchen clock ticked. The fire shifted. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the stable with a low, restless sound that drifted in through the gap at the bottom of the window frame and settled into the room. Nathaniel looked up from his hands. His face had completed whatever process it had been going through, and what was left was not defeat and not fury, but something harder and more purposeful than either. "I need to ride to Billings," he said. "Yes," Clara said, "but not yet. Not until we've established the attorney contact and have the written record in someone else's hands. If you ride to Billings angry, and Stead hears about it before you've got legal standing—" "He'll accelerate," Nathaniel said. He had already thought it. "He'll accelerate," Clara confirmed. Nathaniel looked at her. "How long to get the attorney engaged?" "I can write tonight. Harrison Cole responds quickly. His reputation depends on it. A week, maybe 10 days to get initial advisement." "And Purdy, the cattle buyer. If we move that conversation forward—" "I can write to him tonight as well," Clara said. "But I want you to read the letter before it goes, this time." She said the last two words without inflection, but they landed with meaning nonetheless. Something moved across Nathaniel's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite, but in the territory adjacent to one. "Fair enough," he said. Clara pulled the inkwell and paper toward herself. "Tell me what you want him to know," she said. And Nathaniel Blackwood, who had spent 14 years running a ranch, largely in the isolation of a proud man's self-sufficiency, began to talk to Clara Whitmore, the way you talk to someone you have decided to trust. Not holding back the edges of things. Not managing the presentation, but directly and in full, with the plain confidence of a person who has decided that the time for managing alone is finished. They worked until past 10. The letters took 3 drafts between them. Nathaniel's instinct for the particulars of the cattle business combining with Clara's precision about framing and implication until the finished versions said exactly what was needed without signaling urgency or desperation. When they were done, Clara sealed them and set them on the edge of the table to go out with the Morning Post writer. Nathaniel watched her seal the second letter and set it down. "When I hired you," he said, "what did you tell yourself you were walking into?" Clara looked up. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the kind of question people like Nathaniel Blackwood generally didn't ask women like her. It was a question that assumed she had walked in with intentions of her own. "A kitchen job," she said. "Honest work. Fair pay." "That's all," she considered. "I told myself I would do the job well," she said. "Whatever the job turned out to actually be." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Most people would have kept the job strictly to what they were hired to do," he said. "Read the invoices behind the barrel felt it wasn't their business put them back." "Most people might have," Clara said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him directly. "Because the ranch was worth saving," she said. And somebody needed to believe that. The words sat between them with the simple weight of a true thing. Nathaniel looked at the letters on the table. He looked at the papers they'd worked through over 2 days. He looked at Clara, and in the specific quality of that look, the way it stayed, the way it didn't move to the middle distance, the way his eyes usually did when he was retreating into his own thinking, Clara felt something shift in the room. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where everything changes at once. Just a small, precise shift like a key turning in a lock. "You should have been sleeping hours ago," he said. "So should you," she said. He almost smiled again. Almost. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood," she said. She gathered the ink and paper. He carried the lamp to the corridor entrance without being asked, holding it so she had light to navigate by, and she walked past him and down the hall toward her room, and neither of them made anything of that small courtesy. But she noted it. She noted everything. The next 3 days moved at a pace that felt nothing like the preceding months. Something had been unlocked between them, some door of practical collaboration, that once open revealed how much ground they could cover together that neither of them had been covering at all before. Nathaniel began consulting her on decisions that had nothing to do with the kitchen. He stopped at her doorway on the second morning to ask what she knew about the mill prices in Billings. And on the third afternoon, he brought the fence repair cost estimate to the kitchen table and put it in front of her without preamble, the way you put something in front of someone whose opinion you intend to use. Clara gave her opinion. He used it. Holt noticed. Of course he noticed. Holt was not a stupid man. He was a man who had a position to protect and understood that his position depended on being Nathaniel's primary source of operational judgment. He had held that position for 11 years by being reliable, direct, and unobtrusively indispensable. The presence of a woman in the kitchen who was becoming something other than the woman in the kitchen was a development that required assessment. He began testing it. Small things reporting to Nathaniel on matters he would normally have handled without consultation, specifically when Clara was present. Offering unsolicited assessments of costs that Clara had already addressed. On the third afternoon, he referred to the supplier adjustments as if he had been aware of them for some time and had simply been waiting for the right moment to raise them himself, which Clara knew was not true. And Nathaniel, she could tell from the slight tightening around his eyes, knew was not true either. She said nothing about it. She filed it away. On the fourth day, the first response came back. Not from Harrison Cole in Billings, it was too soon for that. The response came from Gerald Purdy, and it came fast, which told Clara that the door she had already opened through her earlier letter had been wider than she'd presented it to Nathaniel. Purdy was not simply interested in a conversation. He was prepared to make an offer. She read the letter twice. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was in the stable with one of the hands looking at the rear left leg of the gray mare that had been moving stiffly for the past week. He looked up when Clara came in and saw immediately from her expression that she had something. "Give us a minute," he said to the hand. The hand left. Clara handed him the letter. He read it standing up. She watched his face the shift when he reached the specific number Purdy had named, which was lower than the Helena deal had been, but structured across multiple smaller contracts in a way that created a stability the single large contract had never offered. His eyes moved over the figure twice. Then he looked up. "It's less," he said. "Per head, yes," she said. "But Purdy is local. He's reliable. And the multiple contract structure means if one arrangement falls through, the others survive. The Helena model was all or nothing. This is something different." Nathaniel looked back at the letter. "He wants an answer within 2 weeks, which is fine," Clara said. "That's inside the window before Stead makes his next move. If we've got a signed contract with Purdy and a letter engaged from Cole, we're in a very different position than we were 5 days ago." Nathaniel folded the letter. He handed it back to her. Then, without any preceding indication that he was going to say it, he said, "What do you want, Miss Whitmore?" Clara went still. "I beg your pardon. From all of this," he said. He wasn't looking at the letter, or the mare, or the far wall of the stable. He was looking at her in the direct, unguarded way that was becoming more frequent, and that she hadn't yet decided how to respond to. "You've put months of work into saving a ranch that isn't yours. I'd like to know what you want." The question was enormous. Clara recognized that. She also recognized that it deserved a real answer, and not the deflection she could feel herself reaching for, automatically the modest, practical, job-focused response that would let her avoid the larger thing he was actually asking. She looked at him squarely. "I want to stay," she said. "Not as the cook. As what I've been doing, with title and standing appropriate to the work." He held her gaze. "A partner," he said. "A manager," she said carefully. "To start." Something settled in his expression. Not surprise, not resistance, but a kind of quiet reckoning. The look of a man meeting something he has been moving toward without having named it. "To start," he repeated. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Then we finish what we've started first," he said. "Stead, Cole, Purdy. When it's done, we talk about what comes next." "Agreed," Clara said. She turned to go. "Clara," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed differently than Miss Whitmore, not inappropriately, but with a weight that acknowledged something neither of them had said directly. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving when it was easier to go." She turned partway back. "The ranch was worth staying for," she said. She left him in the stable. She walked back to the house at the same pace she always walked, unhurried and deliberate, and she kept her face composed, because composure was the thing that had gotten her through every difficult moment of her life. And this was not a difficult moment. This was the opposite of a difficult moment. But she needed the composure for a different reason now. She needed it because things were moving very fast and getting faster, and what happened in the next 2 weeks would determine everything, and she could not afford to let the warmth of what had just happened in that stable make her less careful than the situation required. Harrison Cole's response arrived on the 6th day. It was 2 pages dense with legal precision, and Clara read it at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning before anyone else was awake. Cole had clearly been watching the territory around Stead's operations for some time. The language he used in describing the acquisition pattern, the deliberate financial strangulation, the positioned buyer, the corrupted introduction chain was specific in a way that told Clara he had seen this before, possibly with Stead himself. His opening advisement was this: do not respond to Stead. Do not confront Douglas Farrow. Do not move money or renegotiate any existing contracts until they had spoken directly, and come to Billings as soon as possible. Clara was still reading the 2nd page when Nathaniel came into the kitchen. He looked at her expression, then at the pages in her hand. "Cole," he said. "Yes," she said. She handed him the 1st page. He read, standing up again. He turned to the 2nd page. She watched him reach the paragraph where Cole named 2 previous ranches properties she didn't recognize that had gone through the identical acquisition sequence. Both had sold. Both sellers had believed they were making a free choice. Nathaniel set the letter down on the table very carefully, the deliberate gentleness of someone managing a response he doesn't want to express at volume. "He's done this before," Nathaniel said. "At least twice," Clara said. "That Cole knows of. And Farrow—" He stopped, started again. "Douglas Farrow has been at this with him." "Cole doesn't name him directly," Clara said. "But the description of the introduction pattern—" "It's him," Nathaniel said. The certainty was flat and heavy. The kind of certainty that comes not from reasoning, but from recognition. 14 years, he said. The man sat at this table and ate dinner and told me my father would be proud. Clara didn't say anything. Some things required their full silence. After a moment, Nathaniel looked up. "When can we be in Billings?" "If we leave day after tomorrow," Clara said, "we can be at Cole's office by Thursday." "We," he said. "The documentation I wrote is in my handwriting," she said. "And I'm the only witness to the conversation in the supply room. Cole will need me there." Nathaniel held her gaze. "You've thought about all of it," he said. "I've been thinking about all of it for 6 weeks," Clara said. And then something happened that Clara had not prepared for, had no documentation for, had no framework to manage. Nathaniel Blackwood crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any performed emotion. He simply took her hand in both of his and held it the way you hold something that has been through more than it should have had to bear, and he said nothing at all. Clara looked at his hands over hers. She looked up at him. Neither of them spoke. The kitchen was very still, and the fire was going, and the morning was coming in gray and cold through the window. And Clara Whitmore, who had been steady through everything, through the 40-hour work stretch, and the conversation with Stead, and the weeks of carrying knowledge alone, and the precise and careful management of every fragile moving piece of a plan that had no margin for error. Clara felt her throat close with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since she'd heard those 2 men talking in the supply room. She hadn't been afraid. She told herself she hadn't been afraid. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and let the moment be what it was. For exactly as long as it could be, 3 seconds, 4, and then she straightened. "I'll write to arrange the Thursday appointment," she said. Nathaniel released her hand. He stepped back. He was not a man who crowded a moment that needed air. I'll tell Holt we'll be gone 3 days, he said. Don't tell him we're meeting with Cole, Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. Not yet, she said. Not until we know exactly what Cole advises. If Holt is the source. If Holt is the source, Nathaniel said quietly. I don't want him warned. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. I'll tell him we're meeting a buyer. That's true enough, Clara said. He nodded. He went to get his coat. He was going out to start the day the same as every other morning, and from the outside, nothing about Blackwood Ranch would look different to anyone watching. Same foreman, same hands, same smoke from the chimney. But the woman who stood in the kitchen reaching for the ink and paper was not the same woman who had arrived 8 months ago with almost nothing. And the man walking across the yard toward the stable was not the same man who had ridden home 2 days ago in the quiet of a person who has given up. Outside, Franklin Stead was waiting for his window. He believed the window would open any day now. He believed the calculation was almost complete. He had made one error in his calculation. He had not accounted for Clara Whitmore. And in 2 days she was riding to Billings to make sure he never got the chance to correct that mistake. Show more. They left before dawn on a Wednesday. Clara had the saddlebag packed the night before the letters, the ledger summaries, the verbatim transcript she had written of Stead's conversation in the supply room, and Cole's 2-page response, all of it organized in order of the sequence she expected Cole to need them. She had also packed a second copy of every document kept separately, because she had learned a long time ago that important things existed more safely in 2 places than one. Nathaniel had the horses ready at 4:30. He didn't ask if she needed help mounting. He simply brought the quieter of the 2 horses to the left side without comment, which was the considerate thing, the thing that acknowledged without making a moment of it. And Clara appreciated it the way she appreciated all the small practical courtesies he had begun extending without fanfare. Holt was awake when they rode out. Clara saw the light in the bunkhouse window, the particular orange of a lamp that has been burning for a while, rather than just lit. She didn't know if he had heard them preparing or simply woke early as a habit. She kept her eyes forward and said nothing, and Nathaniel did the same. They were 3 miles from the ranch before either of them spoke. He was watching, Nathaniel said, not a question. Yes, Clara said. Nathaniel said nothing more for a while. The road to Billings was long and flat in the early dark, and the horses moved at a steady pace that covered ground without urgency. Clara had ridden enough in her life to be comfortable with the silence of a long ride, the particular companionship of 2 people traveling toward the same destination without needing to fill the hours with words. But Nathaniel's silence this morning was a different kind. She could feel it, the specific weight of a man who is deciding something and has not yet decided it fully. About an hour into the ride, he said, I've been thinking about Pharaoh. What about him? Clara said. Whether I want Cole to pursue him directly, Nathaniel said, or whether I handle that myself. Clara looked at him sideways. What does handling it yourself look like? It looks like writing to Helena and asking him to his face, Nathaniel said. And then what? A pause. I don't know yet, he said. That's why you shouldn't do it yet, Clara said. Not until Cole tells us what we actually have. A confrontation without legal backing gives Pharaoh time to cover his tracks. Right now, he doesn't know we're coming. Nathaniel's jaw worked. 14 years, he said again. It kept coming back to that. She understood why the number was its own kind of wound, the specific pain of betrayal that has been ongoing for longer than you knew to protect yourself from it. I know, Clara said. Did you know men could do that? He asked. Smile at your table for 14 years and... He stopped. Yes, Clara said quietly. I knew men could do that. He looked at her. Something passed between them that didn't require elaboration. Right, he said. And then, after a moment, I'm sorry. Don't be, she said. Just let Cole do what Cole does first. Then you can decide about Pharaoh. He nodded and turned his eyes back to the road, and they rode on. Harrison Cole's office was on the second floor of a building on the main street of Billings, up a staircase that announced every footstep. He was waiting for them when they arrived, a lean man in his late 50s with the kind of economical stillness that Clara associated with people who had learned not to waste energy on performance. He shook Nathaniel's hand. He shook Clara's hand with the same firmness and the same directness, looking her in the eye, which she noted. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. They both sat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'd like to start with your account of what you heard in the supply room. Not the written version, I've read that twice. I want to hear it in your own voice, in your own sequence." Clara told it again, the same way she had told it to Nathaniel, from the moment she heard the voices to the moment she heard the front door close. Cole asked 3 questions during the telling, the exact phrase Stead had used about good authority, whether she could describe the second man's voice in any distinguishing way, and how much time had passed between the men entering the house and her identifying Stead's voice specifically. She answered all 3 without hesitation. Cole made notes. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at both of them. "The phrase on good authority is the most significant element here," he said. "It implies a specific source, not general observation. Combined with the timing he made that statement before the deal collapsed, it's consistent with insider information." He looked at Nathaniel. "You mentioned a name, Douglas Farrow." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Tell me about him." Nathaniel told him the 14 years, the Stockman's meetings, the Helena connections, the introduction to the buyer who had walked away from the contract. Cole listened without expression, writing notes in a small, precise hand. When Nathaniel finished, Cole sat back in his chair. "I know the name," Cole said. Nathaniel went still. "From what context?" "One of the 2 prior cases I mentioned in my letter," Cole said. "He wasn't the named party. He was a facilitator. We couldn't establish enough at the time to move forward on him specifically, but his name appeared in connection with the introduction chain." Cole looked at his notes. "He's been doing this longer than Stead has. Stead is the visible face. Farrow brings in the targets." The silence in the room had a specific density. Nathaniel said very quietly, "He brought me in." "It appears so," Cole said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I know that's not easy to hear." "How do we stop them?" Nathaniel said. His voice was controlled. The control was doing a great deal of work. "We establish the pattern in documented form and file it with the territorial court," Cole said. "The predatory acquisition statute that passed in 1881 gives us standing if we can demonstrate coordinated intent. Miss Whitmore's testimony, combined with the timeline discrepancies in the supplier pricing and the irregularity of the Helena contract's collapse, builds the foundation." He looked at Clara. "Your records are meticulous. That's going to matter." "What does it mean for Stead's ability to act in the meantime?" Clara asked. "Once we file," Cole said, "he's aware that any acquisition attempt on Blackwood property will draw immediate scrutiny. Most men like Stead aren't willing to operate under that light. They prefer darkness." He paused. "The other element is Purdy. If you sign with Purdy before Stead makes another move, you remove his central argument that the ranch is financially insolvent. A signed cattle contract changes the picture considerably." "We have Purdy's offer letter," Clara said. She reached into the saddlebag and produced it. She placed it on Cole's desk. He read it. He looked up. "How quickly can you respond to this?" "Today," Clara said. Cole looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Something passed between them that was becoming its own language, a quick, precise exchange that carried more than its surface content. "Today," Nathaniel said. Cole nodded. "Then here is what I suggest we do with the next 4 hours." They worked in Cole's office until mid-afternoon, a sustained methodical session that moved from the documentation review to the Purdy contract language to the initial filing framework for the territorial court. Cole was direct and fast, the kind of attorney who did not pad time or decorate his thinking, and Clara found herself keeping pace with him in a way that she could see from his expression he had not entirely anticipated. At one point, he asked her a question about the deed language on the eastern boundary, a specific legal phrasing she had quoted in her notes, and she answered it verbatim. And Cole looked at her for a moment, with the particular assessment of a professional encountering another professional in an unexpected location. "Where did you study?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "I read." He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "What did you read?" "Everything I could reach," she said simply. Cole looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Clara. This time she caught the edge of the expression that had been in his face in the stable, the one she hadn't been ready to name, and she looked away before it could become something she had to decide what to do with in the middle of an attorney's office in Billings. By 3 o'clock, the Purdy contract response was drafted, signed by Nathaniel, and in Cole's hands to be delivered by messenger that afternoon. The court filing documentation was organized and would be submitted the following morning. Cole would write to them within the week with an update. They stood to leave. Cole shook Nathaniel's hand and then turned to Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "In my experience, most ranches in the position Blackwood was in 2 weeks ago do not recover. The ones that do recover almost always have a specific factor in common." He paused. "Someone who was paying attention when everyone else had stopped." Clara said, "The ranch was worth paying attention to." Cole held her hand a moment longer. "So are you," he said. She nodded once and followed Nathaniel out. They were back on the road by 3:30, riding east toward the ranch, with the particular quality of silence that follows a long session of concentrated work. Clara's mind was still running through the filing sequence, the Purdy timeline, the question of Holt, that hadn't been resolved by anything Cole had said, and that was going to have to be resolved some other way. About 2 miles out of Billings, Nathaniel said, "Cole thinks you're exceptional." "Cole is a perceptive man," Clara said. "He's right," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at the road ahead. "You don't need to say that," she said. "I know I don't need to," Nathaniel said. "I'm saying it because it's accurate, and because I've been saying a great deal less than is accurate for the past several months, and I'm trying to correct that." He paused. "I looked at you and saw the kitchen. I saw a large woman who kept to herself and cooked well and asked for nothing. I decided that was all there was to see." "Most people decide that," Clara said. "Most people are wrong," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the grass on both sides of the road, turning it a color that was almost gold, and she kept her eyes on it, rather than on him. "Why do you think that is?" Nathaniel asked. "What makes people decide that fast what someone is worth?" "Easier," Clara said. "It's easier to sort people quickly and move on. Looking at someone carefully takes time. It requires the possibility that you might have to revise what you thought. Most people find revision uncomfortable." She paused. "And for someone who looks like me, a large woman, plain-spoken, no family name behind me, there's nothing in the first impression that costs anyone anything by dismissing. So they dismiss." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "Did you ever—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "Did you ever decide it wasn't worth trying?" he said. "To make people see past it. Did you ever think of just stopping?" Clara considered the question seriously the way it deserved. "Once," she said. "In Laramie. I was 23. I'd just lost the accounting position to the owner's son, and before that, I'd lost a teaching position to a woman whose primary qualification appeared to be that she was small and pretty and spoke softly." She paused. "I sat in my room for 3 days and thought about stopping, about finding the smallest possible life and just fitting into it. Stopping trying to be taken seriously." "What changed?" he asked. "I got hungry," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Practically," she said. "I needed to eat. I needed to work. And when I got up and went looking for work again, I walked into the boarding house in Cheyenne, and the woman who ran it, a widow named Frances Alcott. She looked at me for about 10 seconds and then said, 'I need someone who can run this kitchen and also keep my books because my eyesight is going. Can you do both?' And I said yes." "She saw you," Nathaniel said. "She needed someone," Clara said. "That's different. But it reminded me that being needed and being seen sometimes arrive together, and both are worth having." She paused. I decided stopping wasn't something I was willing to do. Some people deserve to be seen even when the world is slow to do it. I decided I was one of those people. Nathaniel said nothing for a while. The road had turned slightly curving northeast, and the ranch was perhaps 2 hours ahead. Then he said, "You are." Just that. 2 words, quiet and certain. Clara kept her eyes on the road. She kept her breathing even. She did not allow herself the full weight of those 2 words in that moment, because if she did, she would not be able to continue riding at a practical pace toward a ranch that still had several significant problems requiring her attention. She filed it. She filed it in the place where she had filed the expression in the stable, and the hand over hers in the kitchen, and all the other small, precise moments that were accumulating into something she had not yet named, because naming it felt like the kind of optimism that got you hurt. "We need to talk about Holt before we get back," she said. Nathaniel accepted the return to practical ground without comment. "Yes," he said. "If he's been feeding information to Stead," Clara said, "he'll know we went to Billings. He'll know we were gone 3 days. He may already have told Stead." "Which means Stead might move faster," Nathaniel said. "Which means we need to know whether Holt is the source before we arrive back and give him any information about what we did in Billings," Clara said. "Cole's filing won't hit the court records until tomorrow morning. If Stead moves tonight—" "How do we know?" Nathaniel said. "How do we know about Holt one way or the other fast enough to matter?" Clara reached into the saddlebag and produced a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Nathaniel without stopping the horse. He unfolded it and read it. Then he read it again. "You wrote this before we left," he said. "2 nights ago," she said. He looked at the page. It was a letter addressed to Franklin Stead, written in a hand that was not Clara's, but that she had composed. It offered a meeting at the ranch on Friday morning. It implied that Nathaniel was reconsidering his options in light of the failed Helena deal. It was written in language that Stead would find credible, vague enough to not be a commitment specific enough to seem like a genuine opening. "You want to send this to Stead?" Nathaniel said. "I want to see if Holt sends it first," Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. "When we get back," she said, "I'm going to leave this letter on the kitchen table, visibly, in an envelope addressed to Stead. I'm going to tell Holt in passing that you haven't decided yet whether to send it, that you're considering your options. Then we watch whether Stead shows up Friday without having received an invitation." Nathaniel looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. "And if he shows up, then we know," Clara said. "And Cole's filing will already be with the court, and we'll have our answer, and we handle Holt with that knowledge. And if he doesn't show up, then Holt isn't the source," Clara said. "And we owe him an apology he'll never know he's owed, and we find another explanation for how Stead knew about the Helena deal." Nathaniel folded the letter and held it in his hand. The weight of it, the planning in it, the patience it represented was visible in how long he held it before speaking. "You thought of this 2 nights ago," he said. "I think of contingencies," she said. "Clara." His voice had shifted to the register it took when he was about to say something he'd been choosing words for. "You've been 10 steps ahead of everything this entire time. The suppliers, the attorney, Purdy, now this." He paused. "What would have happened to this ranch if you had put those invoices back behind the barrel?" She considered it honestly. "Stead would have had it by spring," she said. "Yes," he said. "He would have." He was quiet for a moment. "And nobody would have known any different. Nobody would have known there was anything to save." "That's usually how it goes," Clara said. "For ranches, for people. The ones that fail quietly, most of them weren't actually failures. They were just failed by the wrong set of circumstances at the wrong time. And nobody ever examined it closely enough to know the difference." They rode in silence for a while after that. The light was changing, pulling long and low across the grass, and the air had the specific bite of an October evening beginning to commit to itself. Then Nathaniel said, "What would you have done if you hadn't heard Stead in that supply room? If it had just been the invoices and the ledger and the overcharging?" "The same things," Clara said. More slowly, with less urgency. You would have fixed it anyway. I would have tried, she said, without being asked. I wasn't asked to notice the invoices either, she said, or to write the supply letters, or to find Purdy in your correspondence file. None of it was asked. Nathaniel turned to look at her fully. The kind of look that doesn't happen when two people are riding together unless one of them has made a deliberate choice to turn and look rather than keep their eyes on the road. Why? He said. And this time the question was different from all the times he'd asked it before. It was not asking about the practical reasons. It was asking about the deeper one. Clara held his gaze. She was a woman who did not look away, and she did not look away now. Because I believe in things that are worth believing in, she said, and I don't require permission to believe in them. Nathaniel held her gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than the road safely allowed, and then he turned back to the front and the horses kept moving and neither of them said anything for the next 20 minutes. They reached the ranch just as the last light was leaving the sky. Holt was at the gate when they rode in, which was unusual. He was not a man who waited at the gate. He held a lantern, and his face in the lamplight was the careful face of a man who has been waiting with news he isn't sure how to present. Trouble, Nathaniel said, reining in. Got a visitor this afternoon, Holt said. Man came by about 2 hours after you left this morning. Said he had business with you. I told him you were in Billings. Clara's hand tightened on the reins. She kept her face still. Nathaniel's voice was level. Who was the visitor? Holt's jaw moved once. Douglas Farrow, he said. The name landed between all three of them like something dropped from a height. Clara watched Nathaniel's face. It did the thing she had seen it do in Cole's office, the contained, precise processing of a man who is feeling something large and is deciding how to hold it. His hands were still on the reins. Everything about him was still. What did he want? Nathaniel said. He said he'd heard about the Helena deal, Holt said. He said he wanted to offer help. Holt paused. He was asking where you'd gone. I told him Billings to see a buyer. Did he ask who the buyer was? Yes, sir, Holt said. I told him I didn't know. Nathaniel looked at Clara. A fast look, a complete exchange in less than 2 seconds. Farrow was moving. The network was reacting. They had perhaps a day, maybe less. Thank you, Holt, Nathaniel said. Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow. Holt looked between the two of them, and Clara could see him trying to read the texture of what he was looking at and not quite getting it. He raised the lantern once in a gesture that was almost a salute and walked toward the bunkhouse. They led the horses to the stable. Inside out of earshot of everything, Nathaniel said quietly, Farrow knows we went to Billings. Yes, Clara said. He'll tell Stead. He already has, Clara said, or he's doing it right now. Nathaniel secured his horse with the focused automatic efficiency of someone whose hands need to do something while their mind runs at a different speed. The filing doesn't hit the court until tomorrow morning, he said. No, Clara said. If Stead moves tonight, he won't have the ranch, Clara said. He can show up, he can pressure, but without a signed purchase agreement and a seller willing to sell, there's nothing he can do tonight that Cole's filing won't answer tomorrow. Unless he has something else, Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. What do you mean? Farrow, Nathaniel said. 14 years of business dealings. If there's a document somewhere, a promissory note, an old agreement, something I signed without reading carefully enough. Is there? Clara said directly. Nathaniel thought about it the way you think about something you are afraid to look at too closely. There was a letter of intent, he said slowly, 3 years ago, regarding a possible partnership arrangement with a landholding company Farrow recommended. I signed it. Nothing came of it, or I thought nothing came of it. I have a copy in the front room filing chest. Clara was already moving. Show me, she said. They went to the house, to the front room, to the filing chest Nathaniel kept against the north wall. He went through it with the focus of a man who needs his hands and his eyes to work together quickly. Clara stood beside him and looked at each document as he passed it. The letter of intent was in the third bundle. Nathaniel held it to the lamp. Clara read it over his shoulder. It was 2 pages, and the language in the second page was the kind of language that looked innocuous on first reading, but was not innocuous at all. A clause about first consideration rights on any land transfer worded broadly enough that a creative attorney could argue it covered a forced sale as easily as a voluntary one. It was 3 years old. It bore Nathaniel's signature, and it was addressed to a holding company whose name Clara had seen before, in Stead's letter. The one Gerald Purdy had shown her a copy of when she'd opened the buyer conversation. The consortium from the East. Clara said very carefully, "Nathaniel." He had already seen it. She could tell by the quality of his silence. "Farrow had me sign a letter of intent to the same consortium Stead is working for," he said, 3 years ago. "Yes," she said, "before any of this started. It may have been the beginning of all of it," she said. "They established a document trail before they began the acquisition process, to give themselves legal cover." Nathaniel set the letter down on the desk. He pressed both hands flat against the surface. He breathed twice slowly and deliberately, the way a man breathes when what he is feeling is too large to speak through and must be managed physically first. Then he straightened. "Get Cole on the Morning Post," he said. "Tonight, if there's any way to reach him tonight." "There's a telegraph office in Meridian," Clara said. "It'll be closed, but the operator lives above the shop." Nathaniel looked at her. "Can you draft a message short enough to telegraph?" "Already thinking about it," she said. He went for his coat without being asked. She was already writing. She had the message drafted in 4 sentences by the time he had the horse saddled. She handed it to him at the stable door, and he read it once, and his eyes moved over the 4 sentences with the fast precision of a man who has learned over the past several days to trust the judgment of the person handing him a document. "This is right," he said. "Ride fast," she said. "I don't know how much tonight we have left." He looked at her in the lamplight just for a moment, the kind of look that in any other circumstance would have required a response from her, would have required some acknowledgement of what it contained. But this was not any other circumstance. "I'll be back in 2 hours," he said. He rode. Clara went back into the house. She put the letter of intent in the saddlebag with the other documents. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning and her hands folded in front of her, and she ran through every piece of what they had, every document, every date, every name, every sequence of events, looking for the thing she might have missed. She did not find one. But there was something else she found sitting at that table, alone in the quiet of the house, while the fire held steady and the clock marked the time. Something she had been setting aside for days, and could not quite continue setting aside. She was afraid. Not of Stead. Not of the letter of intent, or the consortium, or even the possibility that they had missed something. She could handle all of those things. She was built for handling things. She was afraid of the simpler thing, the more dangerous thing. The thing that had been accumulating since a man she had barely spoken to for 5 months had sat across from her at a kitchen table and listened to her, the way no one had listened to her in years. Really listened with his full attention, revising as he heard, treating what she said as something worth revising for. She was afraid because she knew herself well enough to know that she was no longer working for the ranch alone. She was working for him. And that was the kind of thing that could hurt you in ways that had nothing to do with supply contracts or land attorneys or scheming men in Helena. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. She set it down. He came back in just over 90 minutes. The telegraph had gone through. Cole's operator, a night man he trusted, had confirmed receipt and would have the message in Cole's hands at first light. Nathaniel came into the kitchen, still in his coat, and he looked at her, sitting at the table, and he said, "It's done." "Good," she said. He sat down across from her. He looked at her face, and his own face did something careful and specific. "You're scared," he said. She looked at him. "I'm cautious," she said. "No," he said quietly. "I know what cautious looks like on you. This is different." Clara looked at her coffee cup. She looked back at him. She made the decision consciously, the way she made all important decisions, not impulsively, not out of feeling alone, but with her eyes open. I've been doing this for 8 months, she said, working for people who needed what I could give them, taking care of things that mattered to them. And I'm good at it. But somewhere in the past week, I crossed a line between taking care of what matters to you and... She stopped. Nathaniel waited. And caring whether it works out, she said. For you specifically. Not just for the ranch. The kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, the steady, unguarded look that had become familiar and that she still didn't quite know how to meet without feeling the exposure of it. Then he said, Clara, that line you think you crossed. He paused. I crossed it too. She looked at him. I don't know what to do with it any more than you do, he said. And this is not the moment for it. I know that. There's still tomorrow, and Cole and the court filing, and probably Stead showing up here wanting to know what we did in Billings. He stopped. But I wanted you to know. Before any of that. That I know. Clara held his gaze. She held it, and did not look away, and did not deflect, and she let it be what it was, impractical and inconvenient and real. All right, she said. He nodded once. He stood. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. He went down the hall. She stayed at the table a moment longer, her hands wrapped around the cooling coffee cup, and she let herself feel it. The fear and the hope and the particular specific ache of a woman who has spent her entire life being passed over, discovering that someone has finally stopped and looked. Then she stood up, banked the fire, and went to bed. Tomorrow was going to require everything she had. Clara was up at 4:30, the same as always. The difference was that this morning she did not go straight to the stove. She stood at the kitchen window for a full minute, something she never allowed herself, and she looked at the dark outline of the eastern pasture against the slightly lighter dark of the pre-dawn sky. And she thought about everything that was going to happen today, and whether she had prepared for all of it. She had prepared for all of it. She went to the stove. By the time Nathaniel came through the kitchen door at 5:15, the coffee was done, and Clara had the letter of intent laid out on the table alongside her timeline document. A single page she had written at 2 in the morning, when sleep had briefly failed her, mapping the sequence of events from Stead's first visit to the court, filing to the Purdy contract in a clean linear form that an attorney, a judge, or a reasonable man could follow without confusion. Nathaniel looked at the page. He looked at Clara. You didn't sleep, he said. I slept enough, she said. Drink your coffee. He drank his coffee standing, reading the timeline page, and Clara watched his eyes move through it with the focused absorption she had come to recognize as his mode of engaging with something he considered serious. He had stopped performing casualness around her sometime in the past week. She appreciated it. Cole's response, he said. Not yet, she said. Too early. But he received the telegraph. Whatever he does with it, he does from a position of having it. Nathaniel set down the cup. Stead is going to come today, he said. Yes, Clara said. The question is whether Pharaoh comes with him. If Pharaoh comes here... He stopped. You'll say what needs to be said, Clara said. And you'll say it after Cole's filing is in the court record, which it is by now, which means whatever Pharaoh says or does here today happens under legal scrutiny. That's a different conversation than the one he's used to having. Nathaniel looked at her. How do you stay this calm? He said. I'm not calm, she said. I'm focused. Those aren't the same thing. He almost smiled. The almost smiles had become more frequent, and they lasted slightly longer each time, and Clara was trying not to count them. Holt knocked at the kitchen doorframe at 6. He had the particular look of a man who had not slept well or had slept perfectly fine, but was carrying something that showed in his face regardless. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Clara. He looked at Nathaniel. Boys are ready for the fence work, he said. Take them out, Nathaniel said. I need you to stay back today, Holt. Holt's eyes moved fractionally. Something going on? I'm expecting some visitors, Nathaniel said. I'd like you here. It was smoothly done. Nathaniel's voice was easy, the tone of a man managing a routine request. But Clara was watching Holt's face, and she saw it, the specific quality of a man calculating, a man running through possibilities and assessing which of them applied to him. "Sure," Holt said. "I'll send the boys out and come back." He left. Nathaniel looked at Clara. "He'll send word," she said quietly. "If he's been talking to Stead, he'll find a way to get a message out before he comes back. Watch whether he goes straight to the hands or makes a stop first." Nathaniel moved to the side window without making it obvious he was watching. Clara stayed at the table. After a moment, Nathaniel said very quietly, "He went to the hands, sent them out, and then he went to the far side of the stable." "How long?" Clara said. "He's still there." They waited. The clock above the fireplace moved through 2 minutes, then 3. Then Nathaniel said, "He's coming back." Clara picked up her coffee cup. By the time Holt came through the front door and appeared in the kitchen doorway, she was simply a woman drinking coffee at a kitchen table, and the timeline page had been turned face down, and nothing in the room suggested anything other than an ordinary morning. "Boys are out," Holt said. "What do you need from me?" "Sit down, Holt," Nathaniel said. Holt sat. He chose the chair at the far end of the table, which put the maximum distance between himself and both of them, which was a choice Clara noted precisely. "I want to tell you what we did in Billings," Nathaniel said. Holt's face arranged itself into an expression of attentive interest that was just slightly too arranged. "We met with a land attorney named Harrison Cole," Nathaniel said. "We filed documentation with the territorial court yesterday morning regarding a coordinated attempt to acquire Blackwood Ranch through fraudulent means. The filing names Franklin Stead as the primary actor and an Eastern consortium as the benefiting party." He paused. "It also names the information source inside this operation who has been feeding Stead details about our financial position and our business dealings." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Holt's arranged expression didn't collapse. He was a controlled man, and it didn't collapse. But something underneath it shifted the way ground shifts before it gives way. His hands flat on the table moved slightly, just slightly. "That's so," Holt said. His voice came out level. "That's so," Nathaniel said. He was looking at Holt with the steady, painful attention of a man who has known someone for 11 years and is now looking at them for the first time. "The filing is already in the court record. It can't be amended without our attorney's involvement. Whatever happens today, whatever anyone says or does today, the document exists." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nathaniel, don't." Nathaniel said. The single word was not loud. It didn't need to be. Holt closed his mouth. "How long?" Nathaniel said. A long silence. Clara held herself very still. This was not her moment to speak. This was the moment she had built toward for 6 weeks, and it belonged entirely to these two men, and the 11 years that were being dismantled between them, one quiet second at a time. 2 years, Holt said. Nathaniel absorbed that. 2 years. It was longer than Clara had estimated, and she saw from the way Nathaniel's shoulders changed that it was longer than he had expected as well. "What did he offer you?" Nathaniel asked. "A percentage of the sale," Holt said. He said it the way you say something you already know sounds worse out loud than it did in your own head. "A position managing the property after the transition. He said the ranch was going under anyway. He said I was protecting my own future." "And Douglas Farrow," Nathaniel said. Holt looked at the table. "Farrow approached me first, before Stead. He said you were in over your head, and that he had buyers who could save the land from going completely to ruin. He made it sound like—" He stopped. "He made it sound like helping them was helping you." Nathaniel stood up from the table. He didn't do anything dramatic. He simply stood and walked to the window and looked out at the eastern pasture, his father's pasture, the land he had nearly lost, and he stood there with his back to the room for a moment. Clara looked at Holt. Holt was looking at the table. When Nathaniel turned back around, he looked older than he had at the start of the week. Not broken, not that. but carrying the specific weight that settles into a person's face when they have revised something they held deeply and the revision cost them. "Get your things together," he said. "I want you gone by noon." Holt stood. He looked like he was going to say something and then decided not to, which was perhaps the most self-aware thing Clara had seen him do. He pushed back the chair. He walked out of the kitchen through the front room and out the door. Nathaniel stayed at the window. Clara stayed at the table. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm sorry," Clara said finally. "Not about being right. About the 11 years. So am I," Nathaniel said. He turned from the window. His face had settled back into its working expression, the composed, forward-looking face of a man who knows he cannot afford to stay in the moment of loss for long. "Stead will be here before noon." "Yes," Clara said. "And when he comes, I want to be in the room." Nathaniel looked at her. "I know," he said. Franklin Stead arrived at 20 minutes past 10, and he did not come alone. He had the soft-voiced man with him, the Eastern Consortium representative, whose name Clara now knew from Cole's documentation, was a man called Aldrich Pemberton, a lawyer from Philadelphia who specialized in land acquisition for industrial interests. Pemberton was slight and well-dressed and carried a leather case, the kind of case that contained documents prepared in advance, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what they intended to accomplish this morning. They also had a third man, someone Clara didn't recognize, heavy-set, with the particular stillness of hired muscle presented in a suit. He stayed near the door when they came in, and Nathaniel looked at him once and said nothing. Stead shook Nathaniel's hand with the practiced warmth of a man who has spent decades disguising his purposes as kindness. He did not extend his hand to Clara. He looked at her the same way he had before the dismissive sweep that returned to Nathaniel. This time Clara smiled at him. He didn't quite know what to do with the smile. "Mr. Blackwood," Stead said, "I appreciate you seeing us. I know this is a difficult time, and I want you to know that everything we discuss today comes from a place of genuine concern for—" "Sit down, Mr. Stead," Nathaniel said. Stead sat. Pemberton sat beside him, opening the leather case on his knees. The third man stayed standing near the door. Nathaniel sat across from them. Clara took the chair at the corner of the table, the same corner where she had sat the night Nathaniel came home from Helena, the night that had started all of this. It was a deliberate choice. She wanted to be able to see both men's faces. "I'll be direct," Stead said. "We're prepared to make a formal offer today. Given the current state of the ranch's finances, we believe a clean sale at a fair price is in your best interest." "What price?" Nathaniel said. Stead named a number. It was, as Clara had estimated 8 months of preparation ago, approximately 40% below market value for the land, the stock, and the improvements. Clara watched Nathaniel's face. It gave away nothing. "That's your fair price," Nathaniel said. "Given the circumstances," Stead began. "Given the circumstances," Nathaniel said. "You should probably know that the circumstances have changed somewhat." Stead looked at him. Pemberton looked up from his leather case. The third man near the door shifted his weight. Nathaniel reached across the table and picked up the timeline page Clara had written at 2 in the morning. He placed it face up in front of Stead and Pemberton without comment. Stead looked at it. His face went through a rapid, controlled sequence of adjustments. He looked at Clara. He looked back at the page. He looked at Nathaniel. "Harrison Cole filed documentation with the Territorial Court yesterday morning," Nathaniel said. "The filing covers the coordinated acquisition attempt, the supplier interference, the letter of intent that Mr. Farrow had me sign 3 years ago as a pre-positioning device, and the conduct of the information source inside this ranch's operations." He paused. "All of it is in the court record. It cannot be removed." Pemberton had gone very still. His hands stopped moving on the leather case. He was a lawyer, and he understood what a territorial court filing meant, in a way that Stead, who was a predator but not a legal mind, was only beginning to process. "This is," Stead started. "Documented," Clara said. Both men looked at her. This time, when Stead looked at her, the dismissive sweep was gone. What replaced it was a rapid, sharp reassessment, the look of a man understanding abruptly that he has been misreading the room. "You have no evidence of coordination," Stead said, but his voice had lost its warmth. The practiced smoothness was still there, but the warmth was gone. "A filing is not, Mr. Stead," Clara said. "I was in the supply room on September 14th, when you and Mr. Pemberton stood in this front room and discussed the timeline for this acquisition. I heard you say you had it on good authority that the Helena deal would fall through. I wrote a verbatim account of that conversation the same evening and submitted it with sworn attestation to Mr. Cole." She looked at him steadily. "Would you like me to quote the relevant sections?" Stead stared at her. "She has it memorized," Nathaniel said. Not quite proudly, but close. Pemberton closed his leather case. It was a quiet gesture, almost delicate, but it was the most significant thing that happened in that room all morning. A man who has decided the documents in his case are no longer useful closes the case. "We should discuss this with our own counsel before," Pemberton began. "I think that's an excellent idea," Nathaniel said. He stood. "And while you're discussing it with your counsel should be aware that Gerald Purdy in Billings signed a cattle contract with Blackwood Ranch 2 days ago. We have buyers, Mr. Stead. We have legal standing. And we have documentation of everything you've done in this county over the past 2 years, including 2 other ranches I believe Cole intends to revisit in light of what we've provided." Stead's jaw tightened. For the first time since he had walked in, the performance of reasonableness was gone entirely, and what was left underneath it was neither pleasant nor particularly surprising. It was simply a man stripped of the mask he'd been wearing, and what was under the mask was smaller and meaner than the mask had suggested. He stood. He buttoned his coat. He looked at Nathaniel. "You don't know what you're inviting," he said. "I know exactly what I'm inviting," Nathaniel said. "Legal scrutiny. I find I'm comfortable with that." Stead looked at Clara one final time. She met his gaze without expression, without warmth, without the discomfort he had always counted on producing in women he dismissed and then found inconvenient. She simply looked back at him with the calm, grounded attention of someone who has nothing to hide and knows it. He left. Pemberton followed. The third man pulled the door shut behind them. The sound of the wagon pulling away reached them through the walls and then faded into the particular quiet that follows the departure of a threat. Nathaniel stood in the middle of the room. Clara remained seated. They listened to the silence for a moment, the way you listen to silence after a long noise, checking it, making sure it's real. Then, Nathaniel sat back down. He sat down heavily, not from weakness, but from the specific release of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has finally been permitted to put it down. He put both elbows on the table and put his face in his hands for a moment, just a moment, and Clara let him have it. When he looked up, his eyes were clear. "It's done," he said. "The first part is done," she said. He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd heard him come to it. "Right," he said. "There's still Cole and the court process, and finding a new foreman, and the fence line." "And the eastern pasture expansion," she said. "And the eastern pasture expansion," he agreed. He looked at her. "We should draw up proper terms. For your position. Cole can help us draft something formal." "Yes," she said. "A manager's contract," he said. "With appropriate compensation and standing." He paused. "Though I think we both know the title doesn't quite cover what the actual job is." "It's a starting point," Clara said. He looked at her with the unguarded directness she had come to know as simply the way he looked at her now, without the management of distance he had employed for the first 5 months. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, "on the road from Billings, about deciding you were one of the people who deserved to be seen." Clara was still. "I've spent a long time," he said, "making decisions about people based on the first thing I saw, the most surface thing. I told myself it was efficiency. I told myself that when you've got a ranch to run and 100 decisions to make in a day, you can't stop and look at everything carefully." He shook his head. "I was wrong. And the cost of being wrong wasn't abstract. It was sitting in my kitchen for 5 months while I looked past her." Clara took a careful breath. Nathaniel, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm aware of what you are to this ranch and what your position is, and I'm not trying to make it something it shouldn't be. I just needed you to know that I see you, fully. Not what you can do for the ranch. You. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at the man across the table from her, the rancher who had ridden home broken, who had looked at a feast and seen waste, who had sat in the dark alone and revised everything he believed. And she felt the full weight of what the past 10 days had been. Not just the work of it, but the shift of it, the slow and genuine turning of something that had started as utility and become entirely different. I know you see me, she said. I've known for a while now. He held her gaze. And, he said, it was a single word. It carried everything. Clara had spent her entire adult life being practical about things that other women allowed themselves to be impractical about. She had made that choice consciously at 23 in a room in Laramie when she had gotten up and gone looking for work because she was hungry, and the world was not going to make space for her by itself. She had decided that day to deal in what was real and available rather than what was wished for. But sitting in this kitchen at this table with this man, looking at her the way he was looking at her, she found that the practical woman in her and the honest woman in her were for once in complete agreement. And, she said, I think you should probably give me some time to get used to being seen before you ask me what to do with it. He studied her face for a moment. Then he said, How much time? Not much, she said. Something in his expression shifted and settled in a way she had not seen before. Something that looked, if she was being accurate about it, like relief. Like a man who has been holding a question for a long time and has been given an answer that is not the answer he feared. Then we have time, he said. We have time, she agreed. The weeks that followed were not simple. They never were. There was the court process which Cole managed with the methodical precision of a man who had been waiting for adequate documentation and now had it in abundance. Stead did not fight the filing openly. The calculus of exposure versus retreat was not complicated for a man like him. But it took 3 months of legal navigation before the territorial court issued its formal finding, and those 3 months were not quiet. There were letters from Pharaoh, first conciliatory, then coldly formal, then nothing, and the silence of the final letters was its own kind of answer. Nathaniel wrote back only once a single page that Clara did not read, because he did not offer it, and she did not ask, because some things belong entirely to the person writing them. The new foreman came in November, a man named Sam Breckett, who had worked cattle operations in Wyoming for 15 years, and came with a straightforward character and no existing loyalties inside Blackwood's adversaries. He took instruction from both Nathaniel and Clara without requiring the instruction to come from one source, which was the first thing Clara had evaluated in him, and the reason she had suggested his name to Nathaniel when Breckett's letter of inquiry had arrived in the post. The eastern pasture expansion began in the spring as Clara had planned. The boundary with Aldous Finch's property had been correctly documented and formalized, and Finch himself had become a quiet ally, a man who had been shown the truth of something and had reacted to it with the simple honesty of someone who preferred accuracy to comfortable error. He stopped by the ranch twice in the winter to discuss fencing approaches, and both times he stayed for supper, and both times he addressed his questions about the pasture to Clara as readily as to Nathaniel, which Nathaniel noted with the private satisfaction of someone watching a kind of justice happen in real time. Gerald Purdy's first contracted delivery came in early December and went smoothly. The second contract for the following spring was larger. Purdy wrote in his accompanying letter that he had mentioned Blackwood Ranch to 2 colleagues in Billings who were looking for reliable operations to contract with, and would Nathaniel be open to a conversation. Nathaniel showed the letter to Clara. Clara said they should wait until the eastern pasture expansion was complete before taking on additional volume, but that the conversation was worth having. They agreed. She wrote back to Purdy. The ranch changed. Not the way that stories sometimes suggest. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Not with a single decisive turning point that rearranged everything. It changed the way things change, when someone starts paying attention slowly, and then faster. One corrected thing leading to the next corrected thing. The accumulation of small improvements becoming an overall shift that was not small at all. The long wooden table in the main room changed too. It had always been a place where Nathaniel ate alone, where Clara placed his plate and removed it without sitting down herself, where solitude had been the daily rule of the house. It stopped being that. It stopped being that gradually, and then completely, the way habits end, when the condition that created them no longer exists. Clara sat at that table now, not serving sitting, making decisions and discussing figures and reviewing correspondence, and in the evenings when the work of the day was done, simply being present in the way that two people are present when they have stopped pretending they are something less than what they are to each other. It happened quietly the way everything true happened between them. There was no single declared moment. There was instead a succession of evenings that looked different from the evenings before, and a succession of mornings that moved differently from the mornings before, and a slow accumulating understanding between two people who were both at their cores. People who believed in accuracy, who preferred the truth of a thing to a comfortable approximation of it. On a Tuesday evening in late February, with the winter still holding hard outside, and the fire going in the main room, and the eastern pasture. Expansion drawings spread across the table between them. Nathaniel looked at Clara across the lamplight and said, "I think you've had enough time." Clara looked up from the drawings. She looked at him. She looked at the table between them, the drawings and the figures, and the coffee cups, and the particular domestic accumulation of two people who had been building something together for months. "I think so too," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. There were no speeches. There was no performance of the moment for anyone's benefit. It was simply two people honest with each other, arriving at the same place at the same time, after a long journey that had asked everything of both of them. He reached across the drawings and took her hand. The same way he had taken it in the kitchen months ago with the gentleness of someone handling something they understand the value of. And this time, Clara did not redirect to the practical. This time, she let it be what it was, without filing it away. "The ranch still needs a lot of work," she said, because she was who she was. "It does," he agreed. "The north pasture drainage is going to be a problem come spring thaw," she said. "I know," he said. "You mentioned it in November." "I mentioned it twice," she said. "Twice." He agreed, and this time the smile completed itself. Not the ghost of one. The real thing. And it changed his face in the specific way that smiles change the faces of people who have been serious for a long time, the way it brought out something that had been there all along, waiting for the right condition. Clara looked at him smiling, and she felt something unlock in her chest that she had kept locked for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Something that had been waiting with the same patient discipline she applied to everything else for the right moment. This was the right moment. The ranch that had nearly been taken from a defeated man by calculating predators became something none of those predators had accounted for, not just a recovered operation, not just a protected piece of land, but a home. A place where the work mattered, and the people doing it mattered, and the table at the center of it was set for more than one person every night. The woman they had never looked at twice. The one who had come in with almost nothing, and had been seen as nothing more than useful. She became the person without whom none of it would have been possible. Not because the story required it, because it was simply plainly true. And truth Clara had always believed was the most durable thing in the world. It outlasted schemes. It outlasted dismissal. It outlasted every calculation made by people who believed that what they saw at first glance was all there was to see. It lasted. She lasted. And Blackwood Ranch, the land, the table, the life built on both lasted with her.